Hi, I'm Matt Needham, and this is my lecture on air conditioning and refrigeration preventative maintenance. Let's start right off with air filters. Air filter manufacturers recommend that you change the air filters every 30 to 60 days. And the reason they're telling you that is so that they can make more money. This is not the lecture that you're expecting. You're about to be Needhamized. Most people in their homes, for your average home, residential, if you clean or change the air filter every 6 months, that would be adequate. Now, if you have a lot of carpeting and pets indoors, yes, you may need to replace your air filter more often than that. In this country, we waste millions of dollars every year changing air filters that don't need to be changed. If you ever get in charge of a preventative maintenance program, I want you to remember that. People, it's psychological reasons. People see a brand new air filter. You know what? It is a beautiful thing. It's clean. It has these ridges on it, these pleats. Nice. And then they look at a one that's kind of dirty and they're like, oh my God, that's in my breathing zone. I've got to get rid of that. Let's put a new one in there. But just because an air filter kind of looks dirty on one side doesn't mean it needs to be replaced. You can go off of things like 0.6 inches of water column pressure drop across a 2-inch pleated filter, yes. But a general rule of thumb is if you hold an air filter up to a bright light and you struggle to see light coming through it, it needs to be replaced, okay? That's kind of a good general rule of thumb, but usually the one side of the filter that's really dirty, the other side isn't. If you put your hand across it, your hand's not going to get really dirty. In fact, sometimes a dirty air filter, in fact, filters the air better because now the air has smaller holes to go through and it traps smaller particulates as it gets dirtier. So those are some tips. And I want to say this about preventative maintenance, is that every building and all the equipment and how it's running and where it's running is unique to that building. So you may have a slightly different preventative maintenance program for each machine or each building based on the conditions there, okay? If you have a building and you have package units way up on the roof and it's a very clean area, maybe you don't need to, in a clean building, maybe you don't need to replace air filters that often. However, if across the street they start a massive construction project with a lot of dust, guess what? You've got to change your air filters more often, clean your condensers more often. So you kind of have to see what the circumstances are for that equipment when you create a maintenance program. But create a reasonable maintenance program where you're actually doing things instead of just checking off boxes. And you'll save a lot of money on labor and parts and the focus on the things that you should be focusing on, because if you spend all your time changing clean air filters, you're not doing a lot of other things on this chart. Okay, let's talk about condenser cleaning. That's important, and the most important time, if you only had 1 month a year to clean condensers or have a program for that, it would be right before the first heat wave, or you might think like April, because if you have a pretty dirty air-cooled condenser and that system, whether it's refrigeration or air conditioning, has to run in February, it's going to run okay. It's not going to break down. However, that same system in August will break down. So getting the condenser as clean as possible for air conditioning before the summer so that it can get through that very hot summer when the condenser's outside in a hot environment is important. Sometimes a condenser needs to be cleaned multiple times a year. Sometimes you can just wash it off with a garden hose and a nozzle. Other times, bigger condensers, you may need to use a condenser coil cleaner. I recommend you wearing safety goggles and rubber gloves because you may not make a mistake, but the wind may change and blow that alkabrite or whatever in mist into your eyes. Very irritating. I've had it happen. Now, so you may have to use a pressure washer and chemicals, but for small condensers, not always. A lot of times you can just rinse them off with a nozzle. Try not to ever get too much pressure with a pressure washer and bend the fins over. You have to be careful of that, okay? Condenser cleaning. Also, I would say from my experience, the condensers that need cleaning the most often would be restaurant type condensers on little self-contained units around the kitchen area. Reach-in cases, display cases, little cases, freezer cases where you keep hamburger patties, sandwich salad counter, individual cases. These are near cooking appliances like fryers and burners and stoves and all of this. And those kitchens have grease vapor, and the grease vapor tends to stick to coat the condenser fins, and then any dust that comes, and these are near the floor, and then any dust will just stick to that. So sometimes those would have to absolutely be cleaned like every 60 days or something like that. Otherwise, it's going to have a breakdown. And sometimes it's more difficult to use water inside a kitchen, and it's nice to be able to clean those units when nobody's around and walking over you, where maybe if you had to use a little bit of water instead of just a brush and a vacuum. And here's a condenser cleaning brush. I'll talk about this in a little bit. This is more for residential cleaning of your condenser. Now, you can use a wet dry vac and a brusher, but you can also take some compressed air or something and then put plastic on the other side to clean your condensers, but you want to make sure you don't fill the whole area with dust. But if you can use some water and then vacuum it right up and use a lot of towels, that would actually get it the cleanest. But you probably may not going to be able to do that in a restaurant when people are around, okay, for slippage and things like that. Now, how often have you cleaned the condenser underneath your refrigerator at home? That's the number one death of refrigerators, is that they are brand new, they cost $2,000, and nobody cleans the condenser for 6 years. It's now out of warranty. It dies, the compressor dies, and they're like, well, we maybe need a new refrigerator now. But if you get in there with this, take off the back panel, vacuum out with a wet dry vac, get in there, clean a little bit, vacuum again, turn the hose around, blow, put some plastic tape down to the front of your refrigerator, and then blow with the wet dry vac to get the stuff, and then vacuum again. And you do that just even every other year. See how practical? Every other year on your condenser for home, you're going to be okay. Of course, I have a large Akita that is beautiful, and it sheds, and it sits on the kitchen floor waiting for snacks. Maybe every once a year I might need to clean that condenser because of the Akita. Okay, now, and by the way, you can get this appliance cleaner and use it for furnaces and condensers at the 99-cent store for 99 cents. I did. That's where I got it. Okay, it's handy for all kinds of cleaning. Return air ducts, things like that. You can reach in there and loosen things up and vacuum those out. Also, evaporator cleaning. Now, generally in air conditioning, you rarely have to do that unless somebody didn't change the filters or ran it without a filter, or it's more than 20 years old or something like that. However, that's air conditioning. In refrigeration, we typically do not have air filters. So in commercial refrigeration, those need to be cleaned once in a while. Maybe only every few years, but and you can't use the harsh chemical that you use for the condenser cleaning because it is in the breathing space. It is dealing with the food that we eat, so they're going to use something like a simple green or a mild detergent to clean those evaporators as needed. And then same thing with hot and chilled water coils. They have air filters, but over the course of 15, 20 years, particularly if an air filter got sucked in or you had a bank of air filters and somebody put 4 in instead of 5 because you were sliding them in a channel and it's hard to see, then maybe it bypassed a lot of the filter and now you have to clean the coil. And if the chilled water is near the air filter and then the air passes through the hot water coil, you can use water on this because there's a condensate drain underneath it. So that's nice, okay? Also, with this, cleaning condensate drains is a big part of maintenance, taking and blowing that out. Now, one of the things I even like to do, if you pressurize a system with nitrogen and then you're leak checking it or whatever because you're repairing, not doing maintenance, and then you have to release that dry nitrogen to the air, a lot of times I'll use that to blow out and clean little things, little condensers or drain lines, but using something like dry nitrogen even to purge out your condensate drain lines is important because they can over time get plugged up with gunk, okay? And then we also have belts. Fan belts are the main things that we deal with now, and we'll talk a little bit about air compressors after a while, but fan belts they get cracked, they get loose, and over time they have to be replaced. And you replace these kind of as needed. You should be checking them to see if they have cracks and how loose they are, and then replace them certainly well before they break. Okay, so fan belts or something else we check. Bearings. We have two main kinds of bearings. A sleeve bearing, which we use on a lot of fans, which takes oil, and it's a quieter bearing. And we want those quiet bearings because we're transmitting the vibration from the motors and the bearings and the air down the ductwork, and metal duct is a great conductor of sound. And so by using those sleeve bearings, there's less noise to disturb the occupants, and a lot of times these take oil. Okay, so if they have oil cups, you can add oil to the oil cup, or some big bearings I've worked on actually have like an oil reservoir that you maintain a level of oil in on really big bearings. And you also have ball bearings like you had on your skateboard. These take grease. Now, a couple of general rules, and I recommend you setting a maintenance schedule that you can stick to where you're actually lubricating the bearings as needed. And here's some guidelines. All things equal, the oil is thinner, and if it's not a sealed bearing. Now, let me back up for 1 second. Manufacturers are tending to use sealed bearings more and more and more. In fact, on newer residential systems, it's almost hard to find any bearings that you can oil or grease. However, if you do have a bearing where you can oil it or grease it and pump grease with a grease gun into a grease fitting, also known as a Zerk fitting, these are bearings that need to be maintained. So we need to lubricate sleeve bearings that take oil more often than ball bearings that take grease. The more hours a bearing or motor runs, the more often it needs lubrication. The hotter the environment it's in, the more often it needs lubrication. So the bearing that would need the most amount of lubrication would be a sleeve bearing that takes oil, that runs like all the time, like an exhaust fan might, and is in a very hot location. Those three things, now you may need to be going and dripping oil in that little cup or whatever every 2 to 3 months. Okay? On the other hand, if you have a ball bearing that takes grease and it doesn't run that many hours in a year, and it's in a pretty stable, cool environment, maybe you only need to lubricate it every couple of years. Okay? So there's some guidelines there for maintaining bearings, but figure out what is going to work for you, where you actually have time to do it and to actually do the maintenance on it. Okay? Checking voltage, making sure you have adequate voltage at your equipment. We generally have a problem with low voltage. We almost never have a problem with high voltage. The only time we really do is now, actually here in 2020, and going forward. Sometimes if your neighbor or somebody in your neighborhood, or even in commercial, industrial, whatever, if somebody has solar panels and they're feeding back into the panel, sometimes you might get a little bit high voltage because of somebody's solar panel nearby. Just be aware of that anomaly. Very rare, but we've had it happen. Okay? Now, but low voltage means a loose or dirty connection, a contact that is pitted or blackened. Any of these things cause a loose connection and will cause voltage drop. Okay? And anytime you have a loose connection or a pitted contact, you end up having, it becomes like a baby heater, and it uses up a little bit of that voltage. It's almost like two loads in series. Taking your infrared gun and using this as troubleshooting and maintenance, and shooting terminals on electrical panels, on contactor terminals and things like this, can kind of show you where some loose connections are. So this infrared gun is very handy for finding loose connections. But it also, on maintenance, by the way, when we get here to contactor, you know, if I have the panel open, a lot of times in the power off, I'll just go ahead and torque these a little bit and make sure they're nice and snug as a bug in a rug, and give them a little torque to make sure they're tight. If they're easy to get to and it's quick. I'm going to give you a lot of quick maintenance tips here, things you can do like that make a big difference, okay? So making sure you have adequate voltage and tight electrical connections. Make sure your electrical connections are tight. And then, you know, the air conditioning refrigeration trade's all about temperature. And you can use temperature for tons of things, like we just mentioned, using your infrared gun, right? I can even take supply air temperatures, return air temperatures. Now, on average, for air conditioning, if your evaporator coil is dropping the temperature about 20 degrees, your system generally is working good, okay? Now, just know this, if the relative humidity is really high, like 90%, that same system, now when it's almost raining outside, but it's just a rare day in the summer where it's 90 degrees outside with 90 humidity on the West Coast, that system's only going to be able to drop the temperature 18 degrees, but it's still working good. More likely, though, in Southern California, where I'm from, you might have, like we've had a lot of fires this year, fire danger weather, 10% relative humidity. Situation like that when it's 90 degrees outside, you may be able to drop the temperature 23 degrees across your evaporator coil. So that if the air comes in at 75 degrees, it might come off at 52. And that same system under those three scenarios is working good. You know, a lot of times just doing that for air conditioning, making sure you feel a little warmth coming off your condenser, letting it run for a number of minutes and seeing that temperature drop, feeling that you have good airflow, that also can verify that your charge is okay. It's not necessary to be hooking up the gauges on maintenance very often, okay? Bigger equipment like chillers and giant things like that will have gauges built in, pressure transducers built in. It'll tell you the suction pressure and the head pressure, okay? But just doing that, I'm not a fan of hooking up gauges on maintenance. It's time consuming, and every time you do it, you might lose a half an ounce of refrigerant. Screwing it on to the Schrader, taking it off, and then any refrigerant that might get trapped in bits of your hoses. So lo and behold, someone forces you to do this every 3 months on maintenance. Lo and behold, after 3 years, you're low on refrigerant because you lost little bits. Okay, so that also with refrigeration, if the box temperature is dropping steadily down at a good rate and you feel warmth coming off the condenser, there's a good chance the refrigerant charge is pretty good. Okay. So using temperatures. Now for furnaces, natural gas furnaces, if you see a temperature rise about, now this is not as close or critical as that 20 degrees, about 50 degree rise. So if you turn on the furnace is very cold in the house or the building and it's 60 degrees and the air is coming off into your supply at 110, that's 50 degrees. If it comes off at 115, great. If it comes off at 104, okay, great. You know, and by the way, it's a little counterintuitive. If you have a plugged air filter that's restricting the airflow and just letting a little bit of air through, not much at all, it'll raise it 65 or 70 degrees. Because it slows down the air, it has longer to come in contact with the heat exchanger, but you're not getting enough air out of your vent. And it may be tripping off on high limit. The same thing with cooling. If you see that you have a 28 degree drop across your evaporator, there's a good chance your air filter is plugged. Because it's blocked the flow, it's slowed down the air, it comes in contact with the evaporator longer, the air comes off colder, but you hardly have any air coming out of your supply air vent. Okay, so those two things can clue you off, and it's a little counterintuitive that when I say we have a problem because of a plugged air filter, in cooling, the temperature is lower than it should be, and in heating, it's higher than it should be, but take it to the bank. Okay, vents, return air grills, vents, they get dirty and plugged up. And I can think of nothing more important that you can do to win points with your customer or the head of your company or whatever than cleaning the return air grill. A lot of times people don't know where the condenser is. They're not going up on the roof and checking the air filter or whatever. But they can see the return air grill and see that it's dirty. And if you clean that or take off the grill and, oh my God, take it outside and paint it and then put it back, you're getting promoted, baby. Okay, so cleaning that. The supply air grills almost don't get dirty. You can wipe them down if they're really dirty. But the return air vents and grills, they certainly do get dirty, and cleaning those on maintenance is important because it does restrict the airflow down. Coming over here to air compressors now. Air compressors are used in pneumatics. So we have an air compressor like you have at your gas station when you go to fill up your tire. That's similar. And the air compressor is there, and we're using air signals to go around and go through thermostats and then send those signals generally to either dampers or hot and chilled water valves to open up and let more hot water flow through a hot water coil, or chilled water flow through a chilled water coil, or to damper and allow more or less of that hot or cold air to come out of the ductwork to the zone or the space. And most of the new buildings and facilities that were, almost all of them, were built from 1920 up to like 1988, had pneumatics or air compressors. Okay, so, and there's still tons of these out there. They're fading away slowly, being replaced by digital controls, but it's a slow process. So maintaining these, you have a belt. You want to check to see if it's cracked or not and needs to be replaced. If the air compressor runs a whole lot of hours each month, you may want to change the air compressor oil, and it's special air compressor oil where you drain down the oil and change it like maybe once a year. If it doesn't run very often, maybe every other year. Because it's similar to a car. You have like an air filter that sucks the air from around and compresses it and squeezes it into the air compressor. And so just like your car, the oil gets dirty from the air that's coming and mixing with it. Okay? And also you need to change that filter or clean it as needed, maybe once a year, maybe probably more like every other year. If it's a little bit dirty, I don't have a problem with you shaking it off somewhere and dusting it off, vacuuming it, and putting it back for, so, and then change it next year. Okay, you may be able to do that. Also, because in the air compressor, you're compressing air, and as the air gets compressed, the mechanical friction from the pistons and everything adds heat to that air. And warm air holds more moisture than cold air, and you're squeezing more air and more moisture into a space, and it's there as a vapor, but then the air compressor shuts off and that air cools down, and some of that water condenses to the bottom of your air compressor. So we usually have an auto trap, where a float valve really that takes the water that builds up out the bottom of your air compressor. But they have a drain bypass valve. You should be making sure that you open that and drain any water off as part of maintenance. And then if you do get more than a few drips of water out of there, you'll be like, wait, maybe this auto trap float isn't working good. So that's another thing to check on your air compressors. Okay? Now, water treatment, I could do a whole thing on that. That's dealing with your cooling towers for water-cooled condensers, evaporative condensers. It can also deal with closed loop hot water and chilled water closed loop systems. And then even boilers have like their whole nother way of doing water treatment. So making sure, here's some tips for you. And I know that some of these companies, that guys come out and they never get dirty. They do water treatment. That's all they do from these water treatment companies. And they give you these fancy reports with numbers. You could test yourself to death, and if you don't do anything like clean the tower or vacuum out the mud out of the tower or clean the conductivity controller or something like that, you're not really doing anything, right? So they may tell you, well, your optimum micromose is 1458 based on the calcium in your water. If you just maintain about 1,500 micromose with your conductivity controller in Southern California, you're going to be good, and you're going to be saving as much water as possible. Okay, I've done a lot of water treatment. Now, so you also need to make sure you're pumping chemical on a regular basis, scale inhibitor, algicide. For the scale inhibitor, they have a polymer test. But if you have a reservoir, a big cylinder of scale inhibitor, you can take something like a yardstick, something like this but flat, where you can write on it, and then you can put it down in the container until it hits the liquid level, and then you could put a line with a date on that. And then the next month, you could put a line with the date on it, and then the next month, and you can see how much chemical you're using. And I have these sticks, almost look like tree rings, and it shows the tower running more and pumping more chemical in the summer. And then if you come the next time and do it after like 3 weeks or a month, and it hasn't pumped any chemical, you may have an issue. It could be overflowing water on the tower. The micromose may be okay, but the conductivity controller didn't energize the solenoid, didn't energize the pump to pump chemical, or the chemical pump could be bad or not primed or something like that. So also, it's not a bad idea maybe once a year, even in mid-season, to take a wet dry vac, coil it up, and this is what those water treatment companies never do. I used to do it. And you coil up a big wet dry vac hose and you put it in your tower. And then you create a siphon and you throw it up over the edge and then you suck the mud off the bottom or the dust. Okay? And then certainly once a year you take your cooling tower out of service, usually in the winter, and then pressure wash the whole thing down, any bits of scale and dirt down the drain, and you clean it up and then, refill it, put conditioner in it. Also, one thing you want to check on your cooling towers and evaporative condensers is the float valve to make sure it's maintaining a nice water level and it's not overflowing, right? Your tower over the drain pipe. Now, so those are a few tips on water treatment, in particular with cooling towers and evaporative condensers. Let's talk about some tips on furnaces. It's good to do a general service on your furnace right before you need to use it. Like in Southern California, this is actually Halloween night that I'm making the movie October 31st. And so this is a good time, I haven't used the furnace yet, to do a general maintenance on the furnace. So I'm going to take the covers off. I'm going to get in there with a wet dry vac and get all the dust I can off immediately. Okay? You can take like a paper clip and curl it around, and the little spuds coming off the manifold that shoot the gas out. Sometimes spiders like to build their nests or webs and or die in there. And so taking this and wrapping it around and cleaning those little spuds or orifices, because if you have some of those plugged, you can build up, and then sometimes you may have heard a furnace the first time it starts up in the winter, it goes boom, and the panels make a noise and pop. A lot of times that might be some dirt, debris, or spiders in one of those burners near the hot surface igniter that gets blown out of there. But you should be cleaning those every season. And also another tip I have for you is after you get your mani-pedi, okay, you say, can I have that? And then you get one of these, right, which is a basically a popsicle stick with sandpaper on the head, on the other end, which is known as an emery board. And this is really good for cleaning flame sensors, flame rods, to sense the flame on a burner. It reports back to the circuit board going, yeah, the burners are on, I got that verified. This is in the flame all the time. It can get blackened over time and weak. Also, your thermocouples in the standing pilot can get blackened over time, and they may not hold the pilot. And sometimes if you just get that in there and then shine that up, it'll work for you and even repair the system. I've had that just be the problem and done that, and certainly the furnaces have gone at least another year or so to get me out of the woods to finish the service call. So that's something to do on maintenance that I'll do this fall for my furnaces, polish my flame sensor on it, okay? So there's a tip. Also, compressed, well, this is actually R152A, and it does bother me that it has a global warming potential of 140. Shh, this doesn't make sense to me. But using something like this, or compressed air, if you have compressed air or nitrogen, to blow out your furnace. Get down into the burners, blow in there, get on the combustion blower, get into your evaporator fan motor, blow the dust out from inside the windings with this little red attachment there, okay? And do that and clean up, and also mainly your circuit board. Your circuit board can die because it gets full of dust and gets hot. So gently blowing out your circuit board, then coming back over gently and not touching the circuit board, but using your wet dry vac to now get off the extra dust that you just finished with your propellant here, right? And you may also be able to use your brush to get in there and do some extra cleaning too, or a smaller type of brush for your burners. Okay, so that's some tips on furnaces. that you want to do, and you want to check. You can also check the carbon monoxide level coming out of supply air vents. You really shouldn't have anything like that. If you have 2 or 3 or 4 parts per million coming out of carbon monoxide out of your supply air vent, you probably have a cracked heat exchanger. Yeah. So now evaporative coolers, these are on a lot of restaurants, and they can give you the makeup air. You have all these hoods over your fryers, over your cooktops, over your dishwashers. They take a tremendous amount of air out of your restaurant. You have to make up that air by having an evaporative cooler bring in the air from the outside. Have you ever struggled to open a door to get into a restaurant? That means their hoods are running, but their evaporative cooler's not running. You have a tremendous air pressure, and is trying to get air from the door, the front door of the restaurant. That's why, okay? So making sure those are maintained, and those usually do have little oil cups on each end of the bearing. You have a shaft with a fan, and the shaft is usually about this long, and then you have a bearing on each end, a sleeve bearing, and then these little oil caps that you can lift up, and you drip oil in there. And you should probably do that like twice a year. Fill that thing up with oil, right? If it's running a lot throughout the year, you should do a big maintenance on it like at least twice a year. If it's just a residential thing, where you're only using it in the summer for a house to get some inexpensive evaporative cooling, maybe you could just do a whole big maintenance on it right before you're going to use it, like in May or beginning of June, something like that. It'll get you through that summer. But at least 2 times a year if it's running kind of year-round. And it gives some inexpensive cooling by trickling water over the surface, and it only gives you free cooling if the relative humidity, again, is low. So then the outside air will go over these wet pads and give up some of its heat to cause some of that water to evaporate, and then it blows a cool, moist air into the space. I have a mini one about this big that sits outside my bedroom in the other room, and I turn it on here in Southern California at night when it's cool outside and the relative humidity is like below 40%, and I cool off the bedroom, get some nice humid cool air instead of running the central AC at night to stay cool. So I do that in the summertime. I have like these casement doors with screens on them, and I open them to get some cool air from the evening, okay, in the summertime. But then I put the whole thing away, actually, which I'll probably do here in the middle of November. Now, that's some tips on evaporative coolers. Changing out those pads as needed. Again, if it's a commercial setting, maybe you can get by with leaving those pads in there for almost 2 years. But after 2 years, they're deteriorated because they're outside, they're dirty. Replace those pads. Also, it has a standpipe. Once a year, you should remove that standpipe and rinse down, or twice a year if it's used a lot, and rinse down your pan. It has a float valve in there. Make sure the water level is right. It has a pump with a little screen. Clean that screen. Make sure it's pumping water. We also have these evaporative cooler pads that you put in the bottom just to make sure nothing funky like fungus or algae is growing in that water, which is important, okay? We don't want to get Legionnaire's disease because of an evaporative cooler. Okay? Now, strainers on hot and chilled water systems, usually each hot and chilled water coils have strainers. Those typically you don't do anything on maintenance, but if they get plugged, then you clean them. I will say this, that if you have a 10-story building, the strainers on the first floor in the basement will get plugged. The strainers on the 10th floor will never get plugged. The sediment, the heavier stuff, tends to hang out at the bottom of your building through that water, okay? On the other hand, the problem that you will have on the 10th floor, when you don't have water flow through those coils, is the air in the water, the tiny bubbles that in the fill water, they find their way to the top and plug up the very highest coils with air, and then you don't get good flow. And so you should have an air vent that's letting the air off the top. But if that's not working, you have to manually open a valve and let the air off the top, and then it will work. Those are some good tips for you when you're like, I don't understand, I don't get it. Do that. Now, the strainers that I really want you to clean are for your condenser water. on a regular basis. So again, once a year, you may take your cooling tower out of service in the wintertime, wash the whole thing down. That's not a bad time. Right before your condenser water pump, and you may have a big pipe like this, steel pipe coming in to your water pump, you'll have a 45-degree strainer that goes into the piping. You can take the cap off and pull that out, and then you have this strainer that needs to be cleaned, okay? You can also just sometimes mid-season hook up a garden hose to that and kind of do like a flush on it, which will help keep it clean until you actually are able to remove the whole thing, okay? So that's a tip on your strainers. Ice makers, yes, condensers need to be cleaned on the ice makers. Water filters need to be changed as needed, maybe every year or every other year. The water filter for the water supply line. Also, we have to sanitize and clean our ice makers, and those are two separate procedures. You should really be sanitizing about once a month. This is where you shut off the refrigeration and just hit the pump button or the clean button on your control board for your ice maker. And then it circulates the water, and then you have something like a bleach solution that will kill micro or bacteria, fungus, or protozoa in the water. And then you flush that out, and you drain it down, and you refill it, and you run the pump again a little bit more, and then you flush that out before you refill it. Don't mix that chemical with cleaner, okay? Cleaner is descaling. So you actually sometimes will take a little toothbrush or something and put a stronger concentration and go over some parts of your evaporator and other parts of your drain pan that have these minerals stuck to it. And then you run the pump and clean up that scale and flush it all out many times. Sometimes I'll also, if I'm not working, it's good to do this when the ice maker's empty, because then you can also clean the bin. Put a little bit of bleach in the bottom of the bin or ice machine cleaner and rinse that down just to have everything clean. And you're also really cleaning your drain lines too. They're not condensate drain lines, but you always have a percentage of ice that melts or an overflow line, so you're sanitizing and cleaning that too. Okay? So cleaning may be done like every 3 or 4 months, okay, where you're running this chemical through. There was a girl who won the big science fair, and she did it by walking into all the fast food restaurants just with a cup and walking up and getting some ice and then going into the bathroom and getting a sample of the toilet water. She went back to Daddy's lab, who was a chemist, and they checked the bacteria level, and she showed on average in all the fast food restaurants that the bacteria level was higher in the toilet water, I'm sorry, in the ice than it was in the toilet water, which gave us kind of a boom for cleaning and sanitizing ice makers when this made it on the news 10, 15 years ago. Now, so it's important to sanitize your ice makers and clean them. Now, just a quick tip to finish off the lecture on capacitors. When you're looking at your unit, if you have the panel off, just glance at your capacitor. If the capacitor doesn't look nice and flat like this, if this part is at all swollen up a little bit, your capacitor is going bad. Replace it. Similar on a start capacitor, you have a little vent pop or a membrane, this little circle right here. If this thing is bubbled up at all, it lets you know it's getting hot and it's going bad. So those are my preventative maintenance tips. Thank you.